Hi, everyone. Now that we have talked about the structure of the cell and all of its components, we're going to get a little bit deeper into the actual cell membrane. The cell membrane is arguably one of the more important organelles that every single cell has. In order for a cell to be classified as a cell, it must have a cell membrane. That is one of the things that allows cells the opportunity to be living and function as their cell. If you remember, the cell membrane is responsible for making sure that the cell is protected and it allows the passage of different materials into and out of the cell. Here's our objective for this chapter. We will understand that all living organisms are composed of one or more cells, which are related to the health, growth, and development, and then reproduction of that organism. The cell membrane plays a very important role in each of these components. Chapter 5 is going to be broken up into 3 different sections. We're going to start with just the structure of the membrane today. Then we'll move into what passive transport is, and we'll end with something called active transport. So let's take a look at the structure of the membrane. Here's a few vocab words for us first. The first is a fluid mosaic model. This is a model of the cell membrane structure that depicts the membrane as a mosaic, kind of like a fancy mosaic art piece, where the proteins and molecules are suspended in a fluid bilayer and resemble that of art that is considered mosaic. No two cell membranes are going to look perfectly identical. Selective permeability is a property of all biological membranes that allows them to regulate what materials can pass through the membrane easily and which ones cannot. The plasma membrane is another term for the cell membrane. It is the membrane at the boundary of every cell that acts as a barrier to the outside environment of the cell. And our plasma membrane is made up of phospholipids. This is a lipid or a fat that is made up of a glycerol joined by 2 fatty acids and a phosphate group. They form a bilayer that function as a biological membrane. The plasma membrane has 2 sides to it. The extracellular side, which is the outside of the cell, and the intracellular side, which is the inside of the cell. And you can see just one of these here, this head and 2 fatty acid tails, is a phospholipid. The bilayer is created when our heads of our phospholipid align themselves on both the exterior of the cell and the interior of the cell, putting the fatty acids in the middle. This is because our fatty acids are hydrophobic, which means they are water-fearing. Think of what happens when you try to mix olive oil or any type of oil with water. They're going to separate. That's because that oil is composed of a fatty acid. They do not like to interact with water, but our phosphate heads here on the outside are hydrophilic, meaning they are water loving. So they sit on the outside and the inside of the cell membrane. Put the fatty acid tails in the middle to protect those fatty acids from the water, but also to allow the interaction of water with the cell. There are a lot of components to our cell membrane. First is our phospholipids, which we just talked about. Our cell membrane itself is composed of those 2 layers of phospholipids. Spread out throughout our fatty acid phospholipid bilayer, we have a lot of different materials. The first is enzymes. Enzymes aid in the passage of some materials through the membrane that otherwise cannot squeeze themselves through and in between the fatty acids. We also have proteins. Proteins serve a lot of different purposes for the cell membrane. The primary focus is that they serve as a passageway between the outside and the inside of the membrane. Sometimes this looks like a channel where there's just a protein lined up and things can run themselves right through. Other times it acts more like a doorway that needs to change shape to let these materials through. We also have something called a carbohydrate tag. This is a carbohydrate that sits on the outside of the cell membrane, and it serves as an identifier to the cell. Sometimes it tells the materials what type of protein it is. For example, the protein that allows water through the membrane may have a carbohydrate tail on it that says, "Hi, I'm your passageway for water." Other times it just tells the cell and other cells around it what type of cell it is, so the right material gets to the right cell. And lastly, we have cholesterol. Cholesterol sits on the inside of the membrane in between the fatty acid tails that helps strengthen the membrane. Because our membrane is a fluid model, it is constantly changing. So we do need to have these cholesterols on the inside bonding our phospholipids together to strengthen the membrane. The membrane is described as a fluid mosaic model. It describes the structure as a diverse protein molecules that are suspended within a fluid phospholipid bilayer. And there are two main characteristics of this that we can break down fluid and mosaic into. The first is fluid. Cell membranes or plasma membranes are very flexible. Unlike plants that have that cell wall that holds them rigid and straight, animals and bacterium don't have that. We are able to move much more freely than something like a plant would. Therefore, the cell membrane is considered flexible or fluid, not rigid. The second part of that is the mosaic. The variety of molecules that we just talked about on the last slide that stud the membrane are similar to the arrangement of the colorful tiles that make up a mosaic that have different textures and different patterns that resemble art pieces. And remember I said, no two cell membranes are going to have the exact same molecules in the exact same positioning. In selective permeability, some things have the ability to pass through the membrane very easily due to the fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane. Molecules that are small and nonpolar can pass through the cell membrane very easily. Most of the time, they can wiggle themselves through between the phospholipids. Other times, they may require a protein channel. No matter what, this movement does not require any energy expenditure by the cell, meaning these molecules are moving on their own, and the cell does not need to use energy to get them either in or out. Molecules that are small and polar move through protein channels. And sometimes this does require energy from the cell. Other times it won't. And then large substances are carried through in vesicles whenever energy is present. Large molecules cannot be moved in or out of the cell without energy. We are going to stop here and pick up with our passive transport in our next video.